The night had settled gently over Baker Street, as though London itself had decided to breathe more slowly. Outside the tall windows of number 21B, the street lamps glowed behind a thin veil of fog, their light softened and blurred like stars seen through half-closed eyes. Inside, the sitting room was warm and still. A small fire rested in the grate, no longer crackling, but glowing quietly, its embers pulsing with a steady orange rhythm. Shadows moved lazily along the walls as the flames shifted, stretching, shrinking, like slow dancers who had long forgotten a need to hurry. John Watson sat in his familiar armchair, a book resting loosely in his hands. He had not turned the page in some time. The day had been long, and the hour was late, and his thoughts drifted easily toward the fire, the ticking clock upon the mantel, and the comforting sense of safety that came from routine. Across the room, Sherlock Holmes lay stretched along the sofa, his long frame relaxed, his sharp features softened by the low light. His eyes were half-lidded, not asleep, but not fully awake either, resting in that thoughtful space between attention and rest. The room smelled faintly of old books, polished wood, and coal smoke. It was the kind of scent that suggested stories already told, mysteries already solved, and many more yet to come. For a long while neither man spoke. Only the clock marked the passing of time, its steady tick, 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 echoing softly, like a heartbeat, meant to reassure rather than disturb. Watson finally shifted in his chair, adjusting the blanket across his knees. "You have been unusually quiet this evening, Holmes," he said gently, keeping his voice low, as though the room itself were listening. Holmes did not open his eyes at once. When he spoke, his voice was calm, smooth, and unhurried. "Quiet can be most instructive, my dear Watson," he replied. "One hears things in silence that noise so often conceals." Watson smiled faintly and returned his gaze to the fire. Holmes reached to the side table and retrieved a small case, opening it with unhurried precision. There was nothing hurried or restless in his movements tonight. Everything he did seemed deliberate, measured, as though time itself had slowed to match his pace. Watson watched him for a moment, then looked away again, content simply to be present. Outside, a carriage rolled past on the street below, its wheels muted by distance and fog. Somewhere farther away, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Holmes settled back against the cushions. "London," he murmured, almost to himself, "is never truly asleep. It merely closes one eye." Watson found the thought strangely comforting. Another long stretch of silence followed, unbroken and peaceful. Then, at last, there came a sound that did not belong to the night's natural rhythm. A knock. It was not loud, nor urgent, just a single polite knock at the door below, the kind that waited patiently for an answer, confident that it would be heard. Hudson's footsteps sounded faintly on the stairs, slow and familiar. A door opened. Murmured voices followed, too soft to make out the words, before footsteps approached again. Moments later, Hudson appeared at the sitting-room door, holding a letter. "For you, Mr. Holmes," she said kindly. "A young lady delivered it herself." Holmes sat up, interest stirring gently behind his eyes. He accepted the letter, turning it once in his fingers before breaking the seal. Watson noticed the paper was thick, cream-colored and finely cut, carefully chosen. Holmes read the contents slowly, his gaze moving with measured ease across the page. When he finished, he did not speak at once. Instead, he leaned back once more, holding the letter loosely, as though weighing not its words, but their meaning. "Well?" Watson asked quietly, Holmes handed the letter across. Watson adjusted his spectacles and read. The letter spoke of mystery, but without alarm. It described a woman, Miss Mary Morstan, who had received, for several years, a gift on the same date, a pearl, delivered without explanation, without signature. Now she had received a message inviting her to a meeting, promising answers. At last, Watson lowered the letter slowly. "That is curious," he said. "Indeed," Holmes replied. "And curiosity, Watson, is often the gentlest door through which fate enters." He rose and crossed to the window, drawing aside the curtain just enough to peer out into the fog-bound street. "There is no hint of danger," Holmes continued calmly. "No demand, no threat, only patience." Watson studied his friend's profile, the sharp line of his nose softened by firelight, the distant focus of his eyes. "Will you meet her?" Watson asked. Holmes turned back, a faint smile touching his lips. Of course, mysteries, when ignored, have a habit of growing restless. The clock chimed softly, marking the hour. Holmes folded the letter neatly and placed it upon the mantel beside the clock, as though setting it aside for morning. The fire sighed quietly as a small piece of coal settled inward. Watson leaned back once more, feeling a pleasant heaviness settle into his limbs. Whatever awaited them beyond Baker Street, it would wait until dawn, or at least until rest had been taken. For now, the room returned to stillness. The fire glowed, the clock ticked, and London breathed, slow and steady, beneath its blanket of fog. Morning came quietly to Baker Street, not with urgency, nor with noise, but with a pale light that filtered gently through the curtains, touching the edges of furniture and softening the room's familiar shapes. The fire had long since faded to ash, leaving only a faint warmth behind, like the memory of a pleasant dream. Watson woke slowly, the way one does when the mind is rested and the body feels no need to rush. For a moment he remained still, listening. The city outside was beginning to stir. Somewhere below, a shop door opened. Footsteps passed along the pavement. A distant voice called out, then faded. When Watson rose and made his way into the sitting room, he found Sherlock Holmes already awake. Holmes stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back, gazing out at the street, as though reading a story written in fog and stone. He had changed into fresh clothes, neat and precise, and the sharpness of his posture had returned, though without haste. "Good morning," Watson said quietly. Holmes inclined his head. "You slept well." "I did," Watson replied. "Unusually well." Holmes turned slightly, a knowing glint in his eye. Mysteries often rest best when they have not yet begun. Breakfast was a simple affair. Mrs. Hudson moved softly through the flat, placing cups and plates, with the care of someone who understood that calm was something easily broken. Holmes ate little, but drank his tea slowly, thoughtfully. Watson noticed how his friend's gaze would occasionally drift toward the mantel, where the letter from the previous night lay folded. At last, Holmes reached for it. "It is time," he said gently. They did not hurry. The walk to the appointed address took them through streets that were still waking, shops half open, windows being cleaned, horses led patiently by their reins. London, in the morning, felt less like a machine and more like a living thing stretching itself awake. The address led them to a modest house, neither grand nor neglected. Holmes knocked. After a moment, the door opened to reveal a young woman standing just inside. She was dressed simply, her clothing neat and carefully chosen. There was a quiet grace in the way she stood, hands lightly clasped, posture composed. Her expression held neither fear nor excitement, but something softer, a patient curiosity shaped by long waiting. Mr. Holmes? She asked. I am, Holmes replied, and this is my friend, Dr. Watson. She stepped aside to let them in. I am Mary Morstan, she said. Thank you for coming. The sitting room they entered was small but tidy. Light streamed in through lace curtains, casting gentle patterns across the floor. A vase of fresh flowers rested upon a small table, their scent faint but pleasant. Miss Morstan gestured for them to sit. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then she began. 6 years ago, she said, her voice calm but steady, my father disappeared. He was an officer in the Indian Army. After his return to England, he vanished without explanation. There was no word, no trace. Holmes listened without interruption, his attention complete. A year later, she continued, on the anniversary of his disappearance, I received a package. Inside was a single pearl. No note, no name. She paused, as though feeling the weight of time pass again. Each year since, another pearl has arrived, always on the same date, always without explanation. Watson leaned forward slightly, concern gentle in his eyes. And now? He asked. Miss Morstan reached into a drawer and produced a letter. This arrived yesterday, she said. It asks me to come to a meeting this evening. It promises answers. It says that I have been wronged. Holmes took the letter and read it carefully. When he finished, he nodded once. You did the right thing by bringing this to me, he said. There is no threat here, only patience and intention. Miss Morstan exhaled softly, relief flickering across her features. I have waited so long, she said. I only wished to know the truth. Holmes met her gaze. Truth, he said quietly, is often less dangerous than uncertainty. Arrangements were made without fuss. Holmes would accompany her to the meeting. Watson, at Holmes's request, would come as well. When they parted, Miss Morstan seemed lighter somehow, as though sharing her burden had eased it. That evening, London was wrapped once more in fog. The lamps glowed like floating moons as Holmes, Watson, and Miss Morstan made their way through the streets in a carriage. The rhythm of the wheels against the road was steady and soothing, a gentle rocking motion that invited the mind to wander. Miss Morstan sat quietly, gazing out the window. Do you ever tire of waiting? She asked suddenly. Holmes considered the question. Waiting, he replied, is only tiring when one resists it. When accepted, it becomes rest. The carriage stopped before a large, oddly shaped house, its silhouette rising out of the mist like something half remembered from a dream. A man emerged to greet them, a nervous figure with darting eyes and quick gestures. I am Thaddeus Sholto, he said, wringing his hands. Please, come inside. The house was warm and richly furnished, though something about it felt unsettled, as though it held secrets that had not yet learned how to sleep. They were shown into a sitting room filled with carved furniture and heavy drapes. Candles flickered gently, their flames steady. Sholto spoke quickly, apologetically, explaining that he acted on behalf of his late father, who had known Miss Morstan's father in India. He spoke of secrets, of guilt, of a promise long delayed. Holmes listened calmly, absorbing each word. Before more could be said, a distant sound echoed through the house, a sharp cry, cut abruptly short. The room fell silent. No one moved. Holmes rose slowly. Remain here, he said gently. What followed was discovered without haste. A locked room, a body lying still. No signs of struggle, only silence, heavy and complete. Holmes examined the scene quietly, his movements precise but unhurried. When he returned, his expression was thoughtful rather than alarmed. This, he said softly, is the beginning. Outside, The fog thickened. Inside, the candles burned steadily, and somewhere, far away in time and place, a promise waited to be fulfilled. The fog came softly that night, not as a sudden curtain, but as a slow gathering, thread by thread, until the streets of London seemed to dissolve into a pale, drifting dream. Lamps glowed dimly, their halos widening and fading at the edges, as though light itself had grown tired. Holmes, Watson, and Miss Morstan moved through the streets at an unhurried pace. Their footsteps sounded muted upon the stones, absorbed by the thickening air. Even the city's usual noises, wheels, voices, distant bells, seemed to surrender to the fog's quiet authority. For a time, they walked in silence. Miss Morstan's cloak brushed lightly against her ankles with each step. She held herself calmly, her gaze steady, though now and then her eyes lingered on the hazy outlines of buildings passing by. There was no fear in her expression, only a quiet attentiveness, as though she were listening to something far beneath the surface of the night. Holmes walked slightly ahead, his long stride measured and easy. He appeared perfectly at home in the half-seen world around them, his mind attuned to subtleties that required no haste. Watson followed, content to let the rhythm of walking steady his thoughts. He noticed the way the fog softened every shape, smoothing sharp corners into gentle curves. Even time itself seemed to stretch, moments flowing one into another without clear division. They passed beneath an archway, where their footsteps echoed briefly before dissolving again into quiet. A cat slipped across the road ahead, its form appearing and vanishing like a shadow of a thought. London reveals herself differently at night, Holmes said at last, his voice low and calm. Details fade, but patterns remain. Miss Morstan smiled faintly. I find it peaceful, she said, as though the city's willing to keep secrets for a while. They turned onto a broader street, where the lamps were spaced farther apart. Between them, long stretches of darkness rested like still water. Each pool of light felt separate from the next, islands of warmth in a drifting sea. A carriage passed slowly, its lanterns swaying. The sound of hooves softened to a gentle rhythm. The driver's silhouette was barely visible, his figure reduced to a moving shadow. Watson felt his breathing slow without effort. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp stone and distant smoke. As they walked, Holmes spoke occasionally, not to fill the silence, but to guide it. He spoke of waiting, of how patience sharpened perception rather than dulling it, of how the mind, when allowed to move at its own pace, often uncovered truths without force. Miss Morstan listened closely, her steps falling in time with his words. I have waited many years, she said softly, yet it feels different now. Holmes nodded. Because waiting shared is lighter than waiting alone. They crossed a bridge, pausing briefly at its center. Below them, the river moved unseen, its presence suggested only by a cool breath of air rising from the darkness. Holmes rested his hands on the railing. The Thames, he said quietly, remembers everything. It carries stories the way the mind carries dreams. Watson leaned beside him, gazing down into the mist. Somewhere below, water shifted gently against stone, a sound more felt than heard. They continued on, their destination drawing closer, though no one spoke of it. The house ahead remained unseen, but its presence was felt, like a thought forming slowly at the edge of awareness. At length, Holmes stopped. This is far enough, he said gently. From here we observe. They stood together, watching the fog drift and thin, watching the city breathe. Time passed unnoticed. When at last they resumed walking, it was with the sense that something had settled into place, an alignment not of events, but of understanding. They reached Baker Street once more, the familiar doorway emerging from the mist, like a remembered landmark. Inside, the fire was rekindled. The room welcomed them back with quiet warmth. Miss Morstan removed her cloak, her movements unhurried. "I feel calmer," she said, almost surprised, "as though a night has answered me in its own way." Holmes smiled. "Night often does," he replied. "It speaks in pauses." Watson poured tea, the steam rising in gentle curls. The cups warmed their hands. Outside, the fog continued its slow journey through the streets. Inside, the room held still, and as the clock marked the passing hours, the city rested, wrapped in mist, held in silence, waiting. The house revealed itself slowly. At first, it was only a darker shape within the fog, a broad outline rising where the street bent slightly inward. Then came the details: tall windows set deep into the walls, a wide door framed by stone, and lamps that glowed with a muted amber light, as though even they were reluctant to disturb the night. Holmes paused at the gate. "This," he said quietly, "is a house built by memory rather than comfort." Miss Morstan stood beside him, calm and attentive. Watson noticed how her breathing remained steady, her posture relaxed, as though she trusted the night to unfold at its own pace. They were admitted without delay. Inside, warmth wrapped around them immediately. The air smelt faintly of polished wood and old fabric, the comforting scent of rooms long occupied and carefully kept. The hall was wide, its floor covered by thick carpets that softened every step. A man hurried forward to greet them. He was of slight build, with restless hands and eyes that flickered constantly, as though searching for reassurance in every direction at once. His clothes were fine but worn, his movements quick yet uncertain. "Mr. Holmes," he said, bowing slightly, "I am Thaddeus Sholto. I have been expecting you." His voice trembled, not with fear exactly, but with a kind of nervous eagerness. Holmes inclined his head politely. "You wished to speak with Miss Morstan?" Yes, Sholto said, quickly. "Please come this way. Everything has been prepared." It followed him through a series of rooms, each richly furnished, each lit softly by lamps and candles. Heavy curtains framed the windows. Carved chairs rested in quiet order. Everywhere, Watson noticed the sense of care, and beneath it, a faint unease, as though the house were holding its breath. At last they reached a sitting room and were invited to sit. Sholto remained standing, pacing slightly before them, his hands clasping and unclasping. "I have lived with a burden," he began, "one that was never meant to be mine alone." He spoke of his father, of India, of a promise made long ago between men who believed time could be controlled like a ledger. He spoke without drama, but with a heaviness that suggested years of unspoken thought. Miss Morstan listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. "My father knew yours?" she asked gently. Sholto nodded. "They shared a secret and a responsibility, one that my father carried until his death." Holmes watched him carefully, his expression unreadable. "And the pearls?" Holmes asked. Sholto swallowed. A gesture, a small attempt at balance. He moved to a cabinet and opened it, revealing a collection of delicate objects wrapped in soft cloth. Among them were pearls, matching those Miss Morstan had received over the years. They were meant as a sign, Sholto said, that the debt was remembered. Miss Morstan regarded them without reaching out. "And tonight?" she asked. "Why now?" Sholto hesitated. "Because," he said slowly, "there is something more, something that cannot wait any longer." Before he could continue, a faint sound drifted through the house. It was not loud, not sudden, just a thin, strained noise, like breath caught in a narrow space. Sholto froze. "That would be my brother," he said softly. "He is unwell. Please forgive me." Holmes rose calmly. "Perhaps we should ensure all is well." They followed Sholto up a narrow staircase. The steps creaked gently beneath their feet, as though the house itself whispered with age. At the end of the corridor stood a door, locked. Sholto knocked. There was no answer. With trembling hands, he unlocked the door and pushed it open. Inside, the room was still, too still. A man lay back in a chair near the window, his form motionless, his face turned toward the faint light beyond the glass. The window itself stood open, curtains stirring softly with the night air. Holmes approached without haste. He observed quietly, respectfully. "There had been no struggle," he said at last, "only an ending." Watson felt the room settle into silence, not shock, but acceptance. Holmes noticed something on the wall, a small, curious mark, drawn carefully, deliberately. "The sign," Holmes murmured. "4." Sholto sank into a chair, his energy gone. "This house," he whispered, "was never meant to sleep." They returned to the sitting room below, candles still burning steadily, shadows unchanged. Outside, the fog pressed gently against the windows, indifferent to human concerns. Holmes turned to Miss Morstan. "You will not be alone in this," he said. "Whatever remains unfinished will be brought to rest." Miss Morstan nodded, a quiet strength in her eyes. "I trust you," she said simply. The clock chimed somewhere within the house. Time moved on. And far away, bound by promises older than memory, unseen forces stirred, not in haste, but with patience. Pondicherry Lodge rested behind its walls, like a thought that had never quite found peace. By daylight, it revealed itself more clearly. An oddly shaped building, wide rather than tall, its architecture curious and slightly out of time. The stone bore the marks of age, not decay, but the quiet wear of years spent, holding secrets too carefully. Holmes, Watson, and Miss Morstan arrived in the late morning, when the fog had thinned to a pale memory and the sky hung low and gray. The street outside the house was quiet, as though the city had learned to step lightly here. Holmes paused before the gate, studying the structure with unhurried attention. "Houses," he said calmly, "often reflect the minds that built them." Watson felt the truth of this without needing explanation. Inside, the lodge was warm, though the air felt still, as if movement itself had grown cautious. The rooms were richly furnished, but there was something excessive about it, a sense of comfort layered upon comfort, as though richness had been used to keep unease at bay. Heavy carpets muted their footsteps. Tall cabinets lined the walls, filled with objects gathered from distant places, carvings, weapons long dulled by time, faded fabrics whose stories had been folded away. Miss Morstan walked quietly, her gaze steady. "This was where they lived?" she asked. "Yes," Holmes replied, "and where waiting became a way of life." They were joined soon by officers from Scotland Yard. Athelney Jones entered the room with practiced assurance, his presence solid and grounded. His voice was calm, respectful. "We have secured the premises," he said. "No disturbance. Everything remains as found." Holmes nodded, appreciative rather than impressed. They moved together through the house, room by room. Holmes observed with gentle precision, his attention drawn not to what was obvious, but to what felt slightly misplaced. A chair moved an inch from its mark, rope coiled with care rather than neglect, the faint scent of creosote lingering where it did not belong. Watson watched, fascinated by the ease with which Holmes read the house like a familiar book. This lodge, Holmes said softly, "has been expecting visitors." They returned to the locked room. Daylight softened the space. The man in the chair appeared less imposing now, more human, his stillness peaceful rather than alarming. The open window admitted fresh air, curtains stirring gently as though the room were breathing at last. Holmes examined the walls once more. The mark was deliberate, he said. A reminder, not a threat. Watson felt strange calm settle over him. Even death here seemed quiet, resolved. Miss Morstan stood near the doorway, composed. "My father," she said after a moment. "Was he part of this house's silence?" Holmes met her gaze. "He was part of its waiting," he replied, "and waiting leaves traces." They descended to the lower rooms, where a long dining table stood untouched, settings laid as though for guests who never arrived. Dust rested lightly upon polished surfaces, suggesting care abandoned rather than forgotten. In a smaller chamber, Holmes paused. On the floor, nearly invisible unless one knew how to look, were faint impressions, footprints, partial and incomplete, small, Watson observed, and light, Holmes agreed, yet certain. Holmes followed the trail patiently, allowing it to guide him without force. It led a side door, then onward into the grounds beyond the lodge. The garden was overgrown, but not wild. Paths still existed beneath the greenery, remembered rather than maintained. A shed stood at the far end, its door slightly ajar. Inside, the scent of rope and oil lingered. Holmes examined the contents quietly, then stepped back. "Our path continues," he said calmly, "but there is no need to hurry." Miss Morstan exhaled slowly. "I feel," she said, "as though something long held has finally begun to loosen." Holmes nodded. Resolution often arrives gently. They returned to the sitting room. Tea was brought, cups set carefully upon a low table. The simple ritual grounded the moment, drawing it away from mystery and toward comfort. Athelney Jones watched Holmes with a thoughtful expression. "You move as though time were on your side," he remarked. Holmes smiled faintly. "Time," he said, "belongs to those who listen to it." Outside, the clouds shifted, allowing a pale brightness to touch the windows. The house seemed to respond, shadows lifting slightly from its corners. As they prepared to leave, Holmes paused once more at the threshold. "This place," he said softly, "will rest now. Houses, like people, grow tired of holding secrets." They stepped back into the street. Behind them, Pondicherry Lodge stood quietly, no longer watchful, no longer waiting. And ahead, the path forward unfolded, not with urgency, but with calm inevitability, like a river finding its course. The locked room did not feel threatening. In the gentle light of late morning, it seemed almost peaceful, like a space that had finally been allowed to grow quiet after years of strain. The air was cool and still, touched only by the faint movement of curtains, breathing at the open window. Holmes stood just inside the doorway, hands loosely clasped behind his back. He did not rush forward. Instead, he allowed his gaze to settle, to adjust, to read the room slowly, the way one reads a familiar page again and again, noticing something new each time. Watson remained a respectful distance away. Miss Morstan stood near the threshold, calm, attentive, her presence steadying rather than anxious. "The absence of disorder," Holmes said softly, "often speaks more clearly than chaos." The chair by the window stood precisely where it had been placed. The floor was undisturbed. The desk nearby bore no sign of struggle. Papers and leaves stacked, ink undisturbed, as though the room had been paused rather than interrupted. Holmes moved closer to the window. "It was opened deliberately," he observed, "not in haste. The latch bears no mark of force Watson nodded, following Holmes's line of sight. Outside, the garden stretched quietly, leaves stirring in a faint breeze. Holmes turned his attention to the walls. There, faint but unmistakable, was the symbol again. 4 small marks were ranged carefully. "The sign is not an announcement," Holmes said. "It is a reminder." Miss Morstan listened, her expression thoughtful. "A reminder of what?" she asked gently. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked slowly around the room, allowing the silence to gather comfortably. "Of a promise," he said at last, "and of time." Athelney Jones entered quietly, his presence respectful rather than intrusive. "We have confirmed," he said. "No one entered or left through the door." Holmes inclined his head. "Then the room is telling us the truth." Watson found that thought oddly reassuring. Holmes crouched briefly, examining the floor near the window. There were faint impressions, light, incomplete, as though made by someone who barely disturbed the ground. "Small feet," Watson murmured. "And careful," Holmes replied. Movement practiced over years. Holmes rose again and dusted his hands lightly. "This room was entered and left without urgency," he said. "Whatever occurred here was expected." Miss Morstan folded her hands together. "My father," she said quietly. "Would he have understood this?" Holmes turned to her. "He would have recognized patience," he said, "and resolve." They left the room together, closing the door gently behind them. The latch clipped softly into place, sealing the stillness once more. Downstairs, the house seemed to breathe more easily now, as though relieved to have been understood. Light filtered through the windows, touching the rich fabrics and polished wood, softening their weight. Holmes paused near a side table where a coil of rope rested, neatly wound. "This," he said calmly, "was not placed here by chance." Watson leaned closer. "It seems unused," he said. "Yet ready," Holmes replied. They followed a quiet path through the house, Holmes guiding them not by speed, but by certainty. Each step felt natural, inevitable. Outside, the garden awaited them. The grass was damp beneath their feet, cool and forgiving. Holmes walked slowly along the faint path, his gaze lowered, attentive to details most would miss. "There," he said gently. At the edge of the lawn, near a line of shrubs, were more impressions, again small, again light. "They do not hurry," Holmes observed. "They never have." Watson felt his breathing slow, matching the rhythm of Holmes's words. The trail led toward the shed at the far end of the garden. Holmes opened the door carefully. Inside, the space was tidy. Tools rested where they belonged. A sense of order prevailed. Holmes inhaled lightly. "Creosote," he said, "and river air." Miss Morstan closed her eyes briefly. "The river," she whispered. "Yes," Holmes replied. "Soon." They returned to the house once more. Tea was served again, the warmth of the cups grounding the moment. Conversation remained minimal, each person content to sit within their own thoughts. Watson observed Holmes quietly. There was no excitement in him, no thrill of pursuit, only calm attention, like a watchful guardian of truth. "This case," Watson said softly, "does not seem to trouble you." Holmes smiled faintly. "Trouble arises from resistance," he said. "This story wishes to be told." Outside, clouds drifted lazily across the sky. Light shifted, then settled. Athelney Jones stood, preparing to leave. "We will continue observation," he said, quietly. Holmes nodded. "That is all that is needed." As they stepped away from Pondicherry Lodge once more, Watson glanced back. The house stood still, no longer watchful, no longer tense. Miss Morstan walked beside them, her steps light. "I feel," she said, "as though something has been named at last." Holmes regarded her kindly. "Names," he said. Bring rest. Ahead, the city waited. The river flowed unseen, and the story, patient and unhurried, continued to unfold, one gentle truth at a time. Mark stayed with them long after they had left Pondicherry Lodge, not as an image, but as a feeling, quiet, deliberate, patient. 4 small signs, drawn without haste, as though whoever had made them had known that time was not an enemy. Back at Baker Street, evening gathered slowly. The lamps outside glowed one by one, and the familiar room welcomed them with its gentle warmth. Holmes lit the fire with practiced ease and settled into his chair, fingers lightly touching one another. Miss Morstan sat opposite him, her posture composed, her expression thoughtful rather than troubled. Watson poured tea, the sound of liquid meeting porcelain soft and reassuring. "The mark," Miss Morstan said at last. "What does it truly mean?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He watched the fire for a moment, allowing the question to rest. "It is not a threat," he said gently, "nor a warning. It is a signature." Watson leaned forward slightly. "A signature," he echoed. "Yes," Holmes replied. "A way of saying, I was here, I remember." He rose and retrieved a notebook from the shelf, opening it carefully. Inside were sketches, notes, fragments of thought gathered over time. "In India," Holmes continued, "there existed a pact between 4 men. They bound themselves together, not by affection, but by necessity. Each depended upon the others, and each trusted the promise they made." Miss Morstan listened intently. "My father was one of them?" she asked. Holmes nodded slowly. "Yes, and so was Sholto." Watson noticed how Holmes spoke the names without judgment, as though time had softened their edges. "The mark," Holmes said, "was their way of sealing the pact. 4 men, 1 promise." Silence settled comfortably over the room. Outside, a light rain began to fall, tapping gently against the windows. "Promises," Miss Morstan said softly, "can be heavy." "They can," Holmes agreed, "especially when carried alone." He explained then, not as a lecture, but as a quiet unfolding, how the pact had likely formed under pressure, how circumstances had drawn these men together in a distant land, far from familiarity and rest. "There was treasure involved," Holmes said calmly, "but more than that, there was survival." Watson observed Miss Morstan's reaction. There was no greed in her gaze, no excitement, only understanding. "My father never spoke of wealth," she said, "only of duty." Holmes smiled faintly. "That aligns with what we see," he replied. "The pearls were not payment, they were remembrance." Watson considered this. "A way of saying the promise was not forgotten," he said. "Precisely." The fire shifted, sending a soft glow across the room. Shadows moved lazily along the walls. "The man who left the mark," Holmes continued, "does not rush. He has waited many years already. He believes time will complete what force cannot." Miss Morstan folded her hands together. "And what does he want now?" she asked. Holmes met her gaze. "Balance," he said, "and release." The word seemed to settle into the room, finding its place among the ticking clock and the gentle rain. Holmes closed his notebook. "This case," he said, "will not end with a chase of anger. It will end with an understanding of weight, what has been carried and what must be set down." Watson felt a deep calm at this. The mystery no longer felt sharp or restless. It felt tired, as though it wished to sleep. Miss Morstan rose and moved to the window, watching the rain trace quiet paths down the glass. "I do not wish for riches," she said. "Only clarity." Holmes nodded. "And clarity," he said, "is within reach." The evening wore on gently. Conversation faded. replaced by the shared comfort of presence. Watson felt his thoughts slow, his breathing deepen. At last Miss Morstan prepared to leave. Holmes arranged for her safe return, his manner attentive but unhurried. When the door closed behind her, Baker Street returned to its familiar stillness. Holmes resumed his seat. "The mark," Watson said thoughtfully, "feels almost kind." Holmes smiled, just barely. "Kindness," he said, "often arrives disguised as patience." The clock chimed softly. Outside, the rain eased, and somewhere beyond the city's glow, the story of four men, bound by promise and time, continued to move forward, not with urgency, but with inevitability. The night deepened, the fire dimmed, and the mark of the four rested quietly in the mind, no longer a mystery to fear, but a memory asking to be understood. Morning settled over London with a muted glow, as though the city had decided to speak in a quieter voice. Clouds drifted slowly, letting light through in pale, patient bands. The streets moved, but without urgency, doors opening, footsteps passing, the ordinary rhythms of a day beginning without insistence. At Baker Street, the sitting room was calm. Holmes stood by the window, his attention resting on the street below. Watson sat nearby, polishing his spectacles with a soft cloth, more out of habit than necessity. The kettle murmured on the hob, promising warmth. There came a knock, measured, familiar. Athelney Jones entered with a respectful nod, his coat neatly buttoned, his manner practical and composed. "Good morning," he said. "I thought it best we continue." Gently. Holmes smiled faintly. "That is the only way worth continuing." They spoke quietly, voices kept low, as though loudness might disturb the delicate alignment of thought. Jones shared what little there was to share. No dramatic developments, no sudden turns, only confirmations, observations, small details gathered without force. "The river has been watched," Jones said. "Boats noted, nothing unusual." Yet Holmes nodded, satisfied. "Patience," he replied, "is an active state." They stepped out together, the three of them, into the mild air. The walk was unhurried. Holmes set a pace that invited thought rather than demanded attention. London opened round them gentle layers. Markets were setting up, voices rising and falling in friendly patterns. A newspaper seller called out headlines without urgency, the words dissolving into the morning like steam. Watson found himself enjoying the simple act of walking, heel to toe, breath in, breath out. The city felt companionable. They crossed a bridge where the river lay below, calm and reflective. Its surface carried the sky in softened fragments, moving slowly, as if remembering something pleasant. Holmes paused at the railing. "Movement," he said quietly, "need not be hurried to be effective." Jones leaned beside him. "You are certain river matters?" Holmes nodded. "Certainty grows from listening." They continued along the embankment, observing without staring. Boats rested against the shore, ropes slack, wood gently creaking. Men worked quietly, their movements economical, practiced, unshowy. Holmes watched them with relaxed attention, not searching for guilt, but for rhythm. Watson noticed how the act of watching became soothing when stripped of suspicion. They stopped at a small riverside cafe, the sort that existed more for warmth than for profit. Inside, the air was rich with the scent of tea and bread. They took seats by the window. Conversation was minimal. Holmes sipped his tea slowly. Jones glanced out at the river, then back again, content to wait. "This is calmer than I expected," Jones admitted softly. Holmes smiled. Stories resolve best when allowed to breathe. When they left, the clouds had shifted, allowing a little more light to settle over the water. The river answered with a subtle shimmer. They walked on, the city unfolding without resistance. At a quiet stretch along the bank, Holmes stopped again, not abruptly, but as one stops when a thought reaches its natural end. "There," he said gently. Nothing obvious announced itself, only a faint mark in the mud near the water's edge, softened by time and tide. "Small," Watson said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "and recent enough to remember." Jones observed the mark without excitement. "So we follow," he said. "We accompany," Holmes corrected. "There is a difference." They continued along the river, matching its pace. The gentle pursuit felt less like a chase and more like alignment, step meeting step, moment meeting moment. A boat drifted past, its oars dipping lazily. Holmes watched it go, then turned away, unconcerned. "Not yet," he murmured. They paused again near a bend where the river narrowed slightly. The sounds here were softer, water against stone, the faint clink of rigging. Watson felt his thoughts slow, his awareness widen. Nothing needed to happen quickly. Everything felt inevitable in a peaceful way. Jones checked his watch, then slipped it back into his pocket. "We will keep watching," he said. Holmes nodded. "Watching is enough." As the afternoon waned, they returned toward Baker Street, the walk back just as unhurried. The city received them kindly, familiar and steady. Inside the sitting room once more, the kettle was set on again. The chairs welcomed them back. Jones prepared to leave. "I will maintain quiet observation," he said. "No disturbance." Holmes stood to see him out. "Thank you," he said simply. When the door closed, Watson leaned back, feeling the pleasant weight of the day settle into his limbs. "This pursuit," he said, "feels almost kind." Holmes smiled, eyes half-lidded. "Because," he replied, "it is not about catching, it is about arriving." The fire was lit, the clock ticked. Outside, the river flowed, unbothered and constant, and somewhere within that steady movement, the story continued to shape itself, patient, calm, and quietly certain of its ending. The afternoon faded without ceremony. Light softened, losing its edge, settling gently into the rooms of Baker Street. Outside, the street sounds thinned, footsteps grew less frequent, voices more distant, as though the city itself were exhaling after a long day. Inside, the sitting room rested in a familiar stillness. Holmes sat in his chair near the fire, not reading, not writing, simply observing the quiet, as though it were a thing that could be studied. Watson reclined opposite him, hands folded, his thoughts drifting easily between wakefulness and rest. For a long while, neither spoke. Then Holmes reached forward and adjusted a small object on the mantel, an unremarkable thing, placed just so. "Details," he said softly, "are most honest when treated gently." Watson smiled faintly. "I have noticed," he replied, "that you rarely force them." Holmes nodded. "Force causes resistance. Attention invites cooperation." He rose and crossed the room, retrieving a small box from the shelf. Inside were fragments, notes, sketches, impressions, gathered not with urgency, but with care. He spread a few items upon the table, not arranging them into order, but allowing them to exist together. "A footprint," Holmes murmured, touching a sketch lightly. "Small, consistent, familiar with moving unnoticed." Watson leaned closer. "Someone accustomed to silence," he said. "Exactly," Holmes replied. "Silence, once learned, becomes comfortable." Holmes moved to another note. "Creosote," he continued. "Not fresh, not careless, a scent carried rather than spilled." Watson considered this. "River work," he said. Holmes inclined his head. And rope, Holmes added. Prepared, not improvised, coiled by habit. The fire shifted softly, embers settling inward. These are not the details of haste, Holmes said. They are the details of endurance. Watson felt the truth of this settle calmly within him. The mystery no longer felt like something racing toward resolution, but like something gradually loosening its grip. Holmes walked to the window and looked out. Below, the street lamp cast a steady circle of light onto the pavement. Fog drifted lazily through it, passing without urgency. Those who wait, Holmes said quietly, learn to move when movement matters, and to rest when it does not. Watson's breathing slowed. Do you think, he asked gently, that this story has been waiting a long time? Holmes smiled, just barely. Yes, he said, and it is tired. He returned to his chair and closed his eyes briefly, not in sleep, but in thought. When a person carries something for many years, Holmes continued, it becomes part of their rhythm. Removing it too suddenly can cause imbalance. Watson understood. So you allow it to settle, he said. Precisely. The clock chimed softly, marking the hour without demand. Holmes reached again for the notes, selecting one last item, a simple mark drawn on paper. The 4, he said, always the same, always careful. Watson traced the lines with his eyes. It feels almost respectful, he observed. Holmes opened his eyes. Respect, he said, is the clearest sign that this is not chaos, but conclusion. Silence followed, a comfortable silence, like a blanket drawn up around thought. Outside, somewhere far off, a boat's horn sounded briefly, then faded. Holmes listened. The river is patient, he said. It allows stories to come to it. Watson leaned back, feeling the day's remaining tension dissolve. Do you expect movement tonight? He asked. Holmes shook his head slowly. No, he said. Tonight is for preparation, not ours, but theirs. Watson found this reassuring. The fire dimmed slightly as Holmes added another piece of coal. The action was deliberate, gentle, unhurried. They sat together, letting the minutes pass without counting them. Eventually, Holmes spoke again. Small details, he said, do not demand attention. They reward it. Watson smiled, eyes half closed now. I find, he said, that listening to you speak feels settling. Holmes regarded him with quiet warmth. That, replied, is because understanding removes noise. The evening deepened. The fog outside thickened just enough to soften the edges of the world. Baker Street seemed held in a private pocket of calm. Nothing more needed to be done. The details had been gathered. The deductions had been made, not sharply, not triumphantly, but with care. And somewhere, beyond the reach of sight, the story continued to drift toward its next gentle movement, ready but unhurried. The fire glowed, the clock ticked, and rest came easily, carried on the quiet certainty that everything was unfolding exactly as it should. Night returned to the city without announcement. It arrived quietly, folding itself into the streets and rooftops, dimming colors into softer shades, smoothing the sharp lines of the day. Along the Thames, the world slowed even further, as though the river itself had asked for silence. Holmes and Watson walked side by side along the embankment, their pace unhurried, their presence light. Neither felt the need to speak. The river was speaking for them. Water moved below, dark and steady, carrying reflections of lanterns that stretched and broke gently with each small ripple. The air was cool, faintly damp, and carried the familiar scent of stone and tide. Watson rested his hands in his coat pockets, listening. The sounds here were different from the streets above, softer, deeper, oars touching water, rope shifting against wood. The low murmur of voices carried across the surface, then dissolved into nothing. Holmes stopped near the railing. "Rivers," he said quietly, "are excellent listeners." Watson leaned beside him, gazing down. "They never interrupt," he replied. Holmes smiled faintly. A lantern drifted past on a slow-moving boat, its light rocking gently. The man guiding it moved with easy familiarity, as though he and the river had long ago agreed on each other's habits. Holmes watched without staring. "Those who live upon water," he said, "learn to move with it, not against it." They resumed walking, steps falling into a natural rhythm, footstep, breath, pause. The fog hovered low above the river now, not thick, but present enough to soften distance. The opposite bank felt far away, like a remembered place rather than a visible one. They reached a quieter stretch where boats were moored side by side, resting for the night. Wood creaked softly. Lines tugged gently with the tide. Holmes paused again. Here, the air smelled faintly of oil and rope. Watson noticed it too, though he said nothing. Holmes placed a hand lightly on the railing, feeling the cool metal beneath his palm. "Not yet," he murmured. They continued on. Time moved differently along the Thames. Minutes stretched, folded into one another, then passed unnoticed. The city behind them seemed distant now, as though they had stepped out of ordinary hours. At a small landing, Holmes stopped once more. A boat rested there, unremarkable, modest, its lantern dimmed. Nothing about it demanded attention, which was precisely why Holmes noticed it. He did not approach, he did not signal, he simply observed. Watson followed his gaze and felt a gentle curiosity stir. No urgency, no tension, just awareness. The boat rocked lightly. Water whispered against its sides. Holmes stepped back. "We will return," he said calmly. "The river prefers repetition." They walked on, eventually turning back toward Baker Street. The return felt shorter, lighter, as though the night itself had carried them part of the way. Inside the familiar sitting room, the fire was rekindled. Holmes settled into his chair, removing his coat with unhurried ease. Watson poured tea. Neither spoke at first. The silence felt full rather than empty. "The river," Watson said eventually, "feels like the heart of this story." Holmes nodded. "It commembers," he said, "and it carries weight without complaint." Watson found comfort in that thought. The clock ticked softly, marking time without demand. Outside, the Thames continued its steady course, lanterns drifting, reflections breaking and reforming endlessly. Somewhere upon its surface, a story rested, patient, balanced, waiting for the right moment to rise. Inside Baker Street, the fire glowed low, the night deepened. And sleep, like the river, came gently, without force, without sound, carrying the mind toward rest on its slow, unbroken flow. The river chose its moment, not suddenly, not with drama, but with the same calm certainty used to carry everything else. Night lay fully upon the Thames now, and the water moved with a deep, steady rhythm, unconcerned, unbroken. Holmes and Watson returned to the embankment without haste. Their steps felt familiar, as though they had walked this path many times before, even if memory said otherwise. Lanterns glowed softly along the edge, their reflections stretching into long, trembling lines across the dark surface. The air was cool, gentle on the skin. Holmes paused and listened, not just with his ears, but with his whole posture, still, receptive, aligned with the moment. "There," he said quietly. A boat moved farther downriver. its lantern dimmed but present, its shape airily distinct from the darkness around it. It did not rush. It did not hide. It simply moved, as riverside Liz often do, according to tides and habit. Watson felt no surge of excitement, only recognition. They followed, not running, not chasing, simply accompanying the river as it accompanied the boat. A small police launch waited nearby, its engine resting in silence. Athelney Jones, but bored, calm and ready, his presence solid and unintrusive. Holmes joined him with a nod. "Steady," Holmes said. "No need to disturb the water." The launch eased forward, barely whispering as it moved. The river accepted it without complaint, ripples spreading outward and fading almost at once. Watson watched the embankment slip past, lights passing slowly, evenly. The city seemed to be watching them too, not with interest, but with quiet familiarity. Ahead, the other boat continued its course, lantern rocking gently. The distance between them remained constant, unforced. "This feels less like pursuit," Jones said softly, "and more like following a story already written." Holmes smiled faintly. "Stories end best," he replied, "when allowed to reach their own conclusion." The water deepened beneath them, darker now, heavier. Sounds grew fewer. Even the city seemed to recede, giving the river room to speak. Watson noticed the steady rhythm of the engine, the gentle rise and fall beneath his feet. His thoughts slowed, aligning with the movement. The boat ahead drifted toward a narrower stretch where the river curved gently. Trees leaned closer here, their branches forming soft silhouettes against sky. Holmes watched with relaxed focus. "No sudden movements," he said. "The night is doing the work." The lantern on the boat flickered once, then steadied. Watson felt cool night air fill his lungs, then leave again slowly. Time stretched. Eventually, the boat ahead slowed, easing toward the bank. Its lantern cast a soft circle upon the water, illuminating reeds and stone. The launch followed, stopping at a respectful distance. No commands were shouted. No urgency broke the night. Man stood in the other boat, still, composed, his movements economical. He did not appear surprised. He did not appear afraid. He seemed finished. Holmes stepped forward, his voice low and calm. "The river has carried you far," he said. "You may rest now." The man regarded him quietly, then nodded once. Watson noticed how the tension he had not realized he carried began to dissolve. Another figure lay low in the boat, barely visible, unmoving, present, but not central. Jones approached with care, his tone respectful, his movements measured. The exchange was brief, quiet, almost ceremonial. A man stepped onto the launch without resistance. The river accepted the change as it accepted everything, without pause. As they turned back, the lantern light shifted, reflections rearranging themselves naturally. Nothing felt disrupted. Everything felt completed. Watson looked back once more. The stretch of river they left behind returned immediately to stillness, as though it had been waiting for that exact moment. The journey back was slower still. No one spoke. The engine hummed softly. Water whispered against the hull. Watson's eyelids grew heavy, not with exhaustion, but with ease. At the embankment, they disembarked quietly. The city greeted them again, unchanged, indifferent in the best way. Jones handled the remaining details with calm efficiency, his voice low, his manner unassuming. Holmes watched the river one last time. "It has been patient," he said. "We should learn from it." Watson nodded. They walked back toward Baker Street. The streets nearly empty now. Lamps glowed. Windows slept. Inside, the familiar room welcomed them. The fire was lit gently, casting a soft glow. Holmes removed his coat and settled into his chair. Watson sat opposite him, feeling the pleasant weight of the night settle fully at last. "It is over," Watson said, quietly. Holmes shook his head, just slightly. "It has arrived," he replied. "There is a difference." The clock ticked. The fire breathed. Outside, the Thames continued on its way, unshaken, unhurried, carrying the night with it. And with that steady motion, rest deepened, wrapping thought and memory alike in the gentle certainty that nothing more was required. Morning arrived without insistence. It slipped quietly into the city, thinning the night rather than replacing it, softening shadows into pale shapes. Along the Thames, the water looked unchanged, as though nothing of note had occurred, only the steady passage of time, unmarked and unconcerned. Holmes and Watson walked slowly through streets that were just beginning to wake. Doors opened, curtains shifted. Somewhere, a kettle began to sing. Neither man felt hurried. The events of the night had settled into place with a calm certainty, leaving no sharp edges behind. What remained was not excitement, but completion. At Baker Street, the sitting room welcomed them with familiar stillness. The fire from the night before had burned low, its embers resting quietly beneath a thin veil of ash. Watson stirred them gently back to life, the flames responding without protest. Holmes removed his coat and placed it neatly aside, his movements unhurried, precise. "The river has released its story," he said softly. "Now it rests." Watson nodded, pouring tea. "The night felt kind," he said. Holmes smiled faintly. "Kindness often arrives when force is absent." They sat together as daylight grew stronger, filling the room with a pale, forgiving glow. The clock ticked softly, its rhythm steady and familiar. Later that morning, Athelney Jones arrived with quiet efficiency. His expression was calm, his voice measured. "The man gave his name willingly," Jones said. "Jonathan Small." He spoke without resistance. There was no need for pressure. Holmes inclined his head. "He has waited long enough to be ready," Jones continued. The other, his companion, was found weak, exhausted. No struggle, no disturbance. Watson listened, noticing how even the language of the report avoided harshness. "It seems," Jones added, "that nothing further is required." Holmes met his gaze. "That is the best outcome." Miss Morstan arrived shortly after, her presence bringing a gentle warmth into the room. She looked rested, as though a long-held tension had finally eased. Holmes greeted her with calm assurance. "It is finished," he said, without conflict. She closed her eyes briefly, breathing out slowly. "Thank you," she said, "for the quiet." They spoke then of what would follow, not in terms of procedure or consequence, but of understanding. Holmes explained gently, choosing words that carried clarity without weight. "Jonathan Small's story," he said, "would be told fully and calmly. Nothing would be rushed, nothing forced. The past would be acknowledged, not punished by haste." Miss Morstan listened, her expression serene. "My father," she said, "would have appreciated that." Holmes nodded. "I believe so." They spoke of the treasure only briefly. Its existence was acknowledged, but it held no urgency, no power over the room. "Some things," Holmes said, "lose their weight and once their meaning is understood." Miss Morstan agreed. "I feel no pull toward it," she said, "only relief." The morning passed gently. Tea was refreshed. Conversation flowed in quiet currents, never lingering too long on any one thought. Eventually, Miss Morstan prepared to leave. Holmes ensured her safe passage home, his manner attentive but unobtrusive. When the door closed behind her, Acre Street returned once more to stillness. Watson leaned back in his chair, feeling the comfortable heaviness of resolutions settle through him. There was no chaos, he said thoughtfully. Holmes smiled. Chaos, he replied, is a symptom of misunderstanding. This story understood itself. Outside, the city continued its gentle rhythm. Carriages passed. Voices rose and fell. Life resumed without interruption. Holmes stood at the window, watching the street below. The case, he said quietly, has concluded in the only way it could, by being allowed to end. Watson felt his eyelids grow heavy, not with fatigue, but with contentment. The fire glowed softly. The clock marked the hour. Nothing more needed to be done. And in that absence of demand, rest came easily, carried on a certainty that all things had found their place. The room was quiet when Jonathan Small began to speak, not the kind of silence that presses in or demands attention, but the kind that opens, inviting words to settle gently where they belong. Holmes sat opposite him, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady and without judgment. Watson remained nearby, attentive but unintrusive, content to listen. Outside, daylight rested softly against the windows, filtered through thin clouds that seemed in no hurry to move on. Jonathan Small spoke slowly, not because he struggled for words, but because time itself seemed to move differently for him now. Each sentence arrived with care, shaped by years of waiting. It began far from here, he said quietly, in a place where the air was warm and the nights were heavy with sound. Holmes inclined his head slightly, encouraging him to continue. In India, Jonathan said, days stretched long, and men learned patience without realizing it. You waited for heat to pass. You waited for orders. You waited for change. His voice remained even, calm. I was younger then, stronger. I believed time was something you could outrun. Watson noticed how Jonathan's gaze drifted, not to the room, but inward, as though he were watching the past unfold gently before him. There were 4 of us, Jonathan continued, 4 men brought together by circumstance, or rather than choice. He described the setting slowly, dusty compounds, distant calls, the rhythm of days marked by sun and shadow rather than clocks. His words painted the scene without sharp detail, as though memory itself had softened the edges. We were not friends, he said, but we depended on one another. Holmes listened, still and receptive. There came a moment, Jonathan said, when opportunity and danger arrived together. He spoke of treasure, not with excitement, but with resignation, of gold and jewels bound not by desire, but by consequence. The treasure was never the point, he said. Survival was. Watson felt the weight of that settle gently. Jonathan described the pact they made, not dramatically, not solemnly, but as one might describe a necessary agreement made under pressure. We marked ourselves, he said, so we would remember. 4 men, 1 promise. Holmes glanced briefly at Watson, then back again. And Miss Morstan's father? Holmes asked quietly. Jonathan nodded. He was steady, he said, reliable. He believed promises should be kept, even when they grew heavy. Jonathan paused, breathing slowly. Things changed, he continued. They always do. Men were separated. Trust became thinner. His voice did not rise. There was no anger in it now, only acceptance. I lost my freedom, Jonathan said. Years passed. I counted them not by numbers, but by a routine. Watson listened, aware of how gently the story unfolded, without accusation or bitterness. When I returned, Jonathan said, the world had moved on, but the promise had not. He spoke of Sholto then, not harshly, but with a quiet disappointment. Some men hide from the past, Jonathan said. Others carry it too tightly. Holmes remained silent, allowing the words to find their place. The pearls, Jonathan continued, were not a threat. They were a reminder, a way of saying the promise still lived. Jonathan's gaze lifted slightly. "I never wished harm," he said. "Only balance." Watson felt a calm understanding settle over him. The story did not ask for judgment. It asked only to be heard. Holmes spoke at last. "You waited," he said, "for many years." Jonathan nodded. "Waiting became my way of living," he replied. "Once you learn it, you stop fighting time." The room held the silence gently. Outside, a carriage passed, its sound distant and muted. Jonathan continued, speaking of preparation, not of plans, but of readiness, of watching the river, of learning its moods. "The river listens," he said. "It remembers." Holmes nodded, acknowledging the truth without comment. Jonathan's voice slowed further now, as though the telling itself were easing him. "I never meant to disturb the night," he said, "only to complete what had been left unfinished." Watson noticed how the tension that had once surrounded the case felt entirely gone now, replaced by something closer to closure. When Jonathan fell silent, no one rushed to fill the space. Holmes folded his hands together. "Thank you," he said simply, "for telling it quietly." Jonathan inclined his head. "There is no other way," he replied. The light in the room shifted subtly as clouds moved overhead. Afternoon leaned toward evening without ceremony. Watson felt his breathing deepen, his thoughts slowing. The story had begun, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a memory to be laid gently to rest. And as Jonathan Small's words settled into the stillness, the past softened its hold, ready at last to loosen and let go. The memory opened like a door left ajar. Jonathan Small's voice remained low, even, as though he were careful not to disturb the past too suddenly. Holmes and Watson listened without movement, allowing the story to unfold at its own pace. "India," Jonathan said quietly, "was a place where time behaved differently." He paused, and in that pause the room seemed to warm, as though the memory itself carried heat with it. "The days began early," he continued, "not because anyone hurried, but because the sun made the decision for you." He spoke of mornings washed in pale gold, when the air was still cool enough to breathe easily, of wide skies that seemed to stretch farther than the mind expected, and of land that held warmth long after the sun had set. "There was always sound," he said, "birds, insects, distant voices. And yet, silence lived there too." Watson felt the contrast settle gently within him, the coexistence of noise and quiet, movement and rest. "We lived within compounds," Jonathan went on, "spaces built to keep the world at a manageable distance. Inside, there was routine. Outside, vastness." Jonathan described the slow rituals of the day. Water drawn carefully, meals taken without hurry, the simple, repetitive tasks that gave shape to long hours. "In that heat," he said, "haste made no sense. You learned quickly that rushing only exhausted you." Holmes listened, eyes steady, attentive. "The men I met there," Jonathan continued, "were shaped by waiting. Soldiers, laborers, officers, we all learned the same lesson in different ways." He spoke of evenings when the sun dipped low and shadows lengthened, when the air cooled just enough to invite rest, verandas and low voices, of lamps lit gently against the coming dark. At night, Jonathan said, the heat lingered, sleep came slowly, if at all. Watson imagined it, the weight of warm air, the body sinking into stillness, not from tiredness, but from surrender. As when silence grew loud, Jonathan said, not empty silence, full silence. He spoke of lying awake, listening to distant sounds fade and return, of time stretching, expanding, until minutes lost their meaning. It was there, he said, that the four of us came together. He described them without names at first, only impressions. One was cautious, one was proud, one was fearful, and one was steady. Holmes's gaze did not waver. Your father, Jonathan said, nodding slightly toward the space where Miss Morstan might have been, was the steady one. Jonathan spoke of how they were drawn together not by friendship, but by their circumstance, how shared knowledge became shared responsibility. In places like that, he said, trust grows slowly, but once it does, it runs deep. He described the moment when opportunity presented itself, not as a sudden event, but as a gradual realization. There are times, Jonathan said, when the world places something in front of you and waits to see who you become. The treasure entered the story quietly, without sparkle or excitement. It was heavy, he said simply, heavy in more ways than one. Watson noticed how Jonathan never lingered on its appearance, only on its presence. We understood immediately, Jonathan said, that once we touched it, nothing would be simple again. Holmes leaned forward just slightly. And yet you agreed, he said softly. Jonathan nodded. We did, he replied, because at that moment, survival outweighed reflection. He described the pact as something spoken calmly, without ceremony. No oaths, he said. No drama, just understanding. They marked the sign together, not with celebration, but with intention. It was not meant to threaten, Jonathan said, only to remind. He spoke then of how days passed after that, carefully, cautiously, of watching one another, not with suspicion, but with awareness. In the heat, Jonathan said, emotions burned faster. We learned to keep them low. Watson felt the rhythm of the story slow further, like a long exhale. Time did what it always does, Jonathan continued. It separated us. He described orders changing. People moved, promises stretched thin by distance. And then, he said, everything stopped. His voice did not harden. It softened. I lost my freedom, Jonathan said, not suddenly, gradually. He spoke of confinement, not suffering, but as monotony, days that repeated themselves until repetition became all there was. In that stillness, he said, memory grows very clear. He remembered the pact, the sign, the faces of the men who shared it. Waiting became my world, Jonathan said. Waiting and remembering. Holmes remained still, offering nothing but attention. When I was released, Jonathan said, I carried time with me, years, quiet years. He spoke of returning to a world that had moved on, of finding names changed, houses altered, lives continued without him. But the promise, he said, had not moved. Watson felt the weight of unfinished things settled gently. Jonathan's voice slowed even more now. In India, he said, I learned that silence is not empty. It is preparation. He paused, breathing evenly. And that is why, he continued, I did not rush. Why I waited. The memory faded slowly, like heat lifting at dusk. The room at Baker Street seemed cooler by contrast, calmer. Jonathan fell silent. Holmes waited a moment longer than necessary before speaking. Thank you, he said quietly. That was enough. Jonathan nodded once, as though relieved. Outside, evening had begun to settle. Light softened, shadows lengthened. Watson felt his mind drifting, not away from the story, but deeper into its warmth, its patience, its acceptance of time. The past had been spoken, and in being spoken gently, it had lost its urgency, ready now to rest. Jonathan Small did not speak for a while after recalling India. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, layered with memory, like the last warmth held in stone after the sun has gone. Holmes did not interrupt. Watson did not move. The story knew where it wished to go next. "When we speak of the pact," Jonathan said at last, "it sounds larger than it was." His voice remained steady, almost gentle. In truth, it was made quietly, as most lasting things are. He described the four men gathered together in the dim interior of a room, made cool by thick walls. Outside, heat pressed in, constant and patient. Inside, the air barely stirred. "We were tired," Jonathan said, "not only of heat, but of uncertainty." They did not sit close. Each man kept a respectful distance, as though instinctively aware that space mattered. "There was no trust yet," Jonathan continued, "only recognition. Recognition," he explained, "that each of them stood at the same edge of consequence, that whatever happened next would bind them, whether they wished it or not." "The treasure lay between us," Jonathan said, "not physically, in thought. It was not displayed, not admired, only acknowledged. We understood," he said, "that once claimed, it would change the shape of our lives." Holmes listened, fingers lightly touching one another. "And so you agreed?" Holmes said softly. "Yes," Jonathan replied, "because agreement felt safer than division." Jonathan spoke of how the pact was formed without ceremony, no raised voices, no elaborate promises. "We spoke plainly," he said. "What was found would be shared. No man would claim more than another." Watson noticed how the simplicity of it carried weight. "To remember this," Jonathan said, "we marked it." He described the moment not as dramatic, but deliberate. 4 men, one after another, adding their sign. "It was slow," he said, "each mark placed with care." Holmes glanced at the familiar symbol in his mind. 4 simple strokes. "A reminder," Jonathan said, "that no one stood alone." He paused, breathing evenly. "At the time," he continued, "it felt sufficient." Days followed the pact, unremarkable on the surface. Jonathan spoke of how they returned to routine, how the heat pressed on, how the world continued as though nothing had changed. But beneath it, he said, everything was different. They watched one another, not with suspicion, but awareness. Each movement carried meaning now. Each silence felt measured. "In the heat," Jonathan said, "thoughts move slowly. You have time to notice them." Watson felt the rhythm of the telling ease further. Jonathan spoke of Miss Morstan's father then, describing him with quiet respect. "He was consistent," Jonathan said. "In a world that shifted often, he remained steady." Holmes listened closely. "He believed the pact mattered," Jonathan continued, "not because of the treasure, but because of the promise." Jonathan's voice softened slightly. "Others," he said, "felt differently." It did not name them yet. There was no bitterness in his tone, only inevitability. "Time," Jonathan said, "reveals what patience conceals." As weeks passed, subtle changes merged, hesitations, quiet disagreements left unspoken. "The treasure," Jonathan said, became heavier in the mind. He explained how fear entered quietly, not fear of loss, but fear of betrayal. "No one accused," he said, "but everyone wondered." Holmes nodded faintly. "That," he said, "is when balance begins to tilt." Jonathan agreed. "It was not anger that broke us," he said. "It was doubt. The first fracture was small, almost invisible. A decision delayed," Jonathan said. "A message unanswered." Watson felt the calm tension of it, not sharp, but persistent. Once doubt enters, Jonathan continued, it does not rush, it settles. Jonathan spoke of how separation followed, assignments changed, paths diverged. We told ourselves, he said, that distance would help. It did not. The pact remained, but its weight shifted unevenly. And then, Jonathan said, choice arrived. He did not describe it in detail. He did not need to. There are moments, he said, when you see clearly who you are. Jonathan exhaled slowly. Some chose safety, he said. Some chose secrecy. Holmes remained silent. The treasure, Jonathan said, became something hidden, controlled. Watson understood what was being said without it being spoken. I was not there, Jonathan continued, when the final decision was made. His voice remained calm, but something quieter lay beneath it. When I returned, he said, the pact had already been bent. He did not speak of anger, only of realization. I understood then, Jonathan said, that promises can be kept in words and broken in spirit. The room held the thought, gently. Holmes spoke at last. And that, he said, is what you carried with you. Jonathan nodded. Yes, he replied. Not the treasure, the imbalance. Silence returned. Outside, the light shifted again, evening leaning further into night. Watson felt the story settle into him, like a slow tide. The pact had been formed, not with drama, but with intention, and its unraveling had begun, not with violence, but with quiet choices, the kind that take years to fully reveal themselves. Jonathan Small did not raise his voice when he spoke of betrayal. There was no edge to his words, no sharp turn in his tone. What he described belonged to a quieter category of loss, the kind that arrives slowly, settles in, and only later reveals its weight. Betrayal, he said calmly, rarely announces itself. Holmes listened without interruption. Watson felt the room grow still again, as though even the walls had leaned in to hear. It begins, Jonathan continued, as a feeling, something out of place, a pause that lasts a little too long. He spoke of returning after time away, expecting familiarity, and finding instead a subtle distance. Faces that smiled as before, but did not quite reach the eyes. Conversations that ended sooner than expected. No one accused, Jonathan said. No one explained. The heat of India returned in his memory, not as discomfort, but as presence. The way air pressed close to the skin, the way time slowed everything, even doubt. I noticed, Jonathan said, that plans were no longer shared. He described standing in rooms where decisions had already been made, of learning things secondhand, of realizing that the pact still existed in name, but not in practice. The treasure, Jonathan said, had become a secret. Holmes shifted slightly, but did not speak. I did not confront them, Jonathan went on. I waited. Waiting, he explained, had become natural to him by then. Not passive waiting, but attentive waiting, the kind that listens. And while I waited, he said, the world chose for me. He spoke of a night, events move without warning, of orders carried out swiftly by others, of voices raised not in anger, but authority. I was taken, Jonathan said, not violently, officially. Watson noticed how that distinction mattered to him. They told me nothing, Jonathan continued, only that I was to be removed. The separation was clean, efficient, almost polite. In that moment, Jonathan said, I understood. He was accused, not loudly, not dramatically, but firmly. Responsibility placed upon him because it was convenient, because someone had to carry it. I became the weight, Jonathan said quietly, so others could feel lighter. Holmes nodded once, very slowly. Jonathan spoke then of imprisonment, not as suffering, but as duration. The cell was small, he said, but simple. He described the texture of the walls, the way light entered through a narrow opening, how days were marked not by calendars, but by routine. Morning, he said, midday, evening. Watson felt the rhythm settle into him, repetitive and calm. In the beginning, Jonathan continued, there is anger. He did not dwell on it. But anger, he said, burns quickly when there is nothing to feed it. What followed was not rage, but quiet. I learned the shape of the hours, Jonathan said, how they bend if you let them. He spoke of listening to footsteps passing, to distant sounds, to silence, he said, is not empty in confinement. It is full of thought. Homes remain motionless, offering presence without intrusion. I replayed the pact, Jonathan said, again and again, not obsessively, but patiently, each time noticing something new. I saw then, he said, how easily balance can be shifted. The years passed, not counted, but absorbed. At first, Jonathan said, I waited for justice. Then he paused. And then, he said, I stopped waiting for anything. Watson felt the weight of that statement settle gently. When expectation fades, Jonathan continued, you are left with time. He learned how to rest within it, how to let days pass without resistance. I slept, he said. I woke. I ate. I watched light move. There was no bitterness in his voice now, only familiarity. Memory, Jonathan said, became my companion. He remembered India, the heat, the silence, the pact. I did not forget, he said, but I did not cling either. Holmes spoke softly. And when you were released, Jonathan nodded. It happened quietly, he said, as these things often do. No apology, no explanation, simply a door opening where one had been closed. The world, Jonathan said, had changed. He described stepping outside and feeling air move freely again, of sounds arriving all at once, of realizing how much space the sky held. I was older, he said, but calmer. The first thing he sought was not retribution. It was understanding, Jonathan said, to see what remained. He discovered then what had been done in his absence, how the treasure had been claimed, how responsibility had been redistributed conveniently. I did not rage, Jonathan said. I observed. Holmes listened closely. I saw, Jonathan continued, that everyone had made peace with the imbalance, except him. And that, he said, is when waiting began again. This time, waiting with intention, not for revenge, Jonathan said, for completion. Watson felt the story slow even further now, like a deepening breath. The years in confinement, Jonathan said, taught me something valuable. He paused. That nothing forced lasts, he said, and nothing patient is truly powerless. The room at Baker Street felt especially quiet now. Even the clock seemed subdued. Jonathan finished speaking and rested back slightly, his breathing steady. Holmes did not rush to respond. When he did speak, his voice was gentle. You learned how to endure, he said. Jonathan nodded. And how to let time work, he replied. Outside, evening had deepened. Lamps glowed softly in the street below. The world moved on, untroubled. Inside, the story rested, no longer sharp, no longer heavy. The betrayal had passed into memory. The imprisonment had dissolved into understanding, and what remained was not anger, but a calm readiness for the final act of letting go. Jonathan Small rested for a moment before continuing, not from fatigue, but from instinct, an understanding learned over many years that some memories open best When approached slowly, Holmes and Watson remained still, allowing the pause to do its work. "When I left confinement," Jonathan said at last, "it did not feel like freedom." His voice was calm, almost distant. It felt like space. He described stepping into a world that moved more quickly than he remembered, streets that carried new names, faces that passed without recognition, sounds layered thickly upon one another. "I did not rush," he said. "Rushing belonged to a younger man. The first nights," he explained, "were sleepless, not from fear, but from adjustment." Silence felt different now, too wide, too open. "I walked," Jonathan said. "I learned the shape of the city." He spoke of moving through streets without purpose, letting direction find him rather than the reverse, of listening again to footsteps, to water, to the subtle language of places. "The river called to me," he said, not loudly, patiently. Watson felt the truth of that resonate. Jonathan found work that asked little and gave less. It suited him. Routine without attachment, movement without expectation. "I watched," he said, "and I waited." Waiting, this time, was not passive. It was intentional, shaped by years of restraint. "I learned," Jonathan said, "where the past still lingered." He spoke of returning to places connected to the pact, not to confront them, but to understand what remained. Of discovering that some things had been locked away, guarded by fear rather than guilt. The treasure, Jonathan said, had become a thing people hid from, not celebrated. Holmes listened closely. "They feared it," Jonathan continued, "because it reminded them." Jonathan described how he followed the trail slowly, not through force or threat, but through patience, a question here, an observation there. "Time," he said, "does most of the work." Eventually, he found what he had expected to find. The treasure remained, Jonathan said, but it was no longer whole. Watson felt the weight of that statement. "It had been divided," Jonathan continued, "handled, reduced." He did not describe the moment of recovery with excitement. "When I held it again," he said, "it felt wrong. The gold was heavy, not just in the hands, but in the chest." The jewels reflected light goldly, without warmth. "I understood then," Jonathan said. "It had never belonged to us." Holmes nodded slightly. "It had only passed through," Jonathan continued, "leaving weight behind." Jonathan spoke of how he gathered what remained, not with triumph, but with a sense of obligation. The pact, though bent, still existed in memory. "I felt," he said, "that it needed to be finished." His escape from the final place of holding was not dramatic. There were no raised voices, Jonathan said, no alarms. He waited for the right moment, when doors were open rather than forced. When attention was elsewhere, patience, he said, creates its own openings. He moved quietly, carefully, each step measured. "I carried the treasure," Jonathan said, "and felt its burden fully." Watson imagined the weight pressing down, each piece a reminder of choices made long ago. Jonathan spoke of traveling then, of nights spent near the river, of learning its moods more deeply. "The river," he said, "does not judge what it carries." But even as he moved, Jonathan felt the imbalance remain. "I could not keep it," he said. "The treasure did not wish to be kept." He described the moment of decision, not sudden, not emotional, simply clear. "There are things," Jonathan said, "that resolve only when released." One night, beneath a sky softened by cloud and mist, he brought the treasure to the river. There was no ceremony, he said, no anger, only understanding. He stood at the edge, water moving steadily below, lantern light trembling on its surface. "I felt," Jonathan said, that this was where the pact ended. One by one, he released a weight. Not hurriedly, not with force. Each piece sank quietly, vanishing without protest. The river accepted it, Jonathan said. As it accepts all burdens, Watson felt a deep calm settle over him. When the last piece was gone, Jonathan continued, I felt lighter, not triumphant, not relieved, balanced. The treasure, Jonathan said, had been the last thing tying me to the past. Holmes listened without expression, his stillness attentive. I did not expect forgiveness, Jonathan said, only completion. Jonathan described returning to the city afterward, walking slowly, breathing deeply, allowing the night to pass through him. For the first time, he said, I slept. Sleep came easily then, not as escape, but as rest. When Jonathan woke, the world felt quieter. The river, he said, had taken what no longer belonged on land. Watson noticed how Jonathan's voice softened further now, as though the telling itself had eased him. That, Jonathan said, was when I knew the waiting was nearly over. He did not hurry after that. He allowed himself to be seen, to be found. I did not resist, he said. Resistance had already taught me all it could. Silence followed his words, deep, full, gentle. Holmes waited a moment longer than required. Then he spoke. You chose release, Holmes said softly. Jonathan nodded. Yes, he replied, for myself and for the promise. Outside, the evening had settled fully. Lamps glowed steadily. The city breathed without concern. Watson felt his thoughts slow, his breathing deepen. The escape had not been about flight. The loss had not been tragedy. It had been a necessary easing of weight, of memory, of time itself. And with the treasure returned to the river, the past loosened its hold at last, ready now to rest, just as the listener was ready to drift. When Jonathan Small finished speaking, the room did not rush to fill the silence. It lingered, wide, calm, and steady, like water after something has been gently lowered beneath its surface. Holmes remained seated, his posture unchanged, his attention complete. Watson felt no need to move. The story had arrived where it needed to be. Outside the window, evening light rested softly against the glass. The city continued its quiet rhythm, unaware that a long-held weight had just been set down. Holmes spoke at last. Time, he said quietly, has done its work. Jonathan nodded once, slowly. There was no triumph in his expression, no regret, only a deep, settled stillness. I feel, Jonathan said, as though I have been walking for many years and have finally stopped. Watson noticed how naturally the words fell, as though they had been waiting patiently for their moment. Arrangements followed without disturbance. There were no raised voices, no hurried footsteps. Everything moved with the ease of something already resolved. Later, Holmes and Watson found themselves once again by the Thames. Night had returned, bringing with it the familiar calm of lantern light and softened instance. The river flowed as it always had, steady, patient, unchanged by the stories it carried beneath its surface. They stood at the railing together, coats drawn comfortably close, breath visible in the cool air. The river, Watson said softly, feels different now. Holmes considered this. It is not the river that has changed, he said, only what we bring to it. A boat drifted past, its lantern casting a gentle arc of light across the water. Ripples spread outward, then faded, leaving the surface smooth again. Watson watched until the light dissolved into the distance. So much effort, he said, for something that now feels gone. Holmes nodded. That is often the way, he replied. When weight is released, we forget how heavy it once felt. They walked along the embankment at an easy pace, footsteps soft against stone. The city seemed to give them space, sounds falling away naturally. Holmes stopped near a familiar stretch of water. "This," he said quietly, "is where it ended." Watson leaned on the railing, gazing down into the dark flow below. He imagined the treasure resting there, not as an object, but as a memory finally allowed to sink. "There is peace in that," Watson said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "because nothing is being held anymore." They stood in silence, listening to water move against the banks. The sound was rhythmic, reassuring, ancient. Watson felt his breathing match it without effort. Eventually, they turned back toward Baker Street. The walk felt shorter than usual, lighter. Lamps glowed steadily. Windows slept. Inside the familiar sitting room, the fire was lit once more. Holmes removed his coat and settled into his chair, his movements unhurried. Watson poured tea, the steam rising gently between them. For a while, neither spoke. The clock ticked softly. Then Holmes said, "Miss Morstan will sleep well tonight." Watson smiled faintly. "So will Jonathan Small," he said. Holmes nodded. "And perhaps," he added, "so will the river." Watson leaned back, feeling the deep comfort of an ending that did not demand attention. The case had not concluded with force or spectacle. It had concluded with understanding. The fire glowed low. The room breathed quietly. Outside, the Thames continued its steady passage, carrying nothing now but water, light, and time. Watson felt his thoughts slow, drifting easily, like reflections, breaking and reforming on the surface below. Nothing more remained to be solved, nothing more needed to be carried. And in that gentle absence of weight, rest came naturally, settling in like the night itself, calm and complete. The days that followed did not rush forward. They unfolded gently, one into the next, as though time itself had decided to move with care. London resumed its familiar rhythms, carriages passing, shop doors opening, footsteps echoing along pavements. But everything seemed quieter now, softened by what had been laid to rest. At Baker Street, the sitting room held its usual calm. Sunlight filtered through the curtains in pale bands, resting on the edges of books and furniture. The fire was unnecessary today, though its presence lingered in memory, like warmth remembered rather than felt. Watson sat near the window, a book open in his lap. He had been reading the same page for some time without turning it. His thoughts wandered easily, not with restlessness, but with a gentle curiosity about what might come next. Holmes sat across from him, absorbed in his own quiet occupation, sorting papers, not with urgency, but with a sense of completion. Many of them were no longer needed. "You seem thoughtful," Holmes said at last, without looking up. Watson smiled faintly. "I suppose I am," he replied. "Not about the case, but about what follows." Holmes set the papers aside and regarded him calmly. "After a long chapter closes," he said, "the mind often pauses before beginning another." Watson nodded. Miss Morstan arrived later that afternoon. Her presence changed the room in subtle ways. Light seemed warmer. The air felt less still. She carried herself with ease, no longer weighed down by unanswered questions. "Good afternoon," she said softly. Watson rose to greet her, feeling a quiet warmth settle in his chest. There was no sudden rush of feeling, only recognition, steady and reassuring. They spoke for a while of ordinary things, the weather, the city, small moments that had gone unnoticed before. Holmes observed them from his chair, not intrusively, but with a quiet awareness. "You seem lighter," Watson said to Miss Morstan. She smiled. "I feel as though I have been holding my breath for years," she replied, "and only now realized I can breathe again." They took a walk later, the three of them, through streets washed clean by recent rain. The pavement reflected the sky in softened patches. People passed by without hurry. At a quiet corner, Holmes paused. "I will return to Baker Street," he said calmly. "You two should continue." Watson hesitated only a moment before nodding. Miss Morstan smiled in understanding. They walked on together, steps naturally aligning. There was no awkwardness between them, no need to fill the silence. "I have spent so long waiting," Miss Morstan said eventually. "I almost forgot what it feels like to arrive somewhere." Watson considered this. "I think," he said, "that arrival often feels quieter than we expect." She laughed softly. "Yes," she said, "but no less meaningful." They crossed a small bridge where water moved gently below. They paused there, resting their hands on the railing. "I never wanted wealth," she said, "only peace." Watson met her gaze. "I believe," he said, "that you have found it." The moment lingered, not charged, not dramatic, but warm and steady, like sunlight resting on stone. When they returned to Baker Street, Holmes was waiting, as though he had never moved. Evening gathered slowly. Tea was served. Conversation flowed easily, without tension or urgency. Later, as Miss Morstan prepared to leave, Watson walked her to the door. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for listening, for understanding." Watson smiled. "It has been an honor," he replied. After she left, Watson returned to the sitting room. Holmes looked up from his chair. "You are fond of her," he said simply. Watson did not deny it. "Yes," he said, "I believe I am." Holmes nodded. "That," he said, "is a different kind of resolution." Watson felt the truth of that settle gently within him. The evening deepened. Lamps glowed softly outside. The city moved on, content. Watson sat back, feeling a quiet contentment he had not known he was missing. Love, he realized, did not always arrive with intensity. Sometimes it arrived like this, soft, patient, and ready to stay. And as the night settled over Baker Street, the final pieces of the story found their places, not through force, but through care. Dawn came quietly to Baker Street, not with color or brilliance, but with a soft thinning of the dark, as though night itself had decided it was finished and stepped aside without comment. The street lay still beneath a pale sky, lamps glowing faintly even as their purpose faded. Inside number 221B, the sitting room rested in complete calm. The fire had burned low during the night, leaving a gentle warmth behind. Chairs stood where they always had. Books waited patiently on their shelves. Nothing had been disturbed. Nothing needed to be. Holmes sat in his chair near the window, wrapped in the loose robe, his posture relaxed, his gaze unfocused. He was awake, but not thinking in the way he usually did. This was not the alert stillness of deduction. It was something quieter. Watson slept in the armchair opposite him, a blanket drawn loosely across his shoulders. His breathing was slow and even, the rhythm of someone who had finally released the day. Outside, a bird called once, then again. Holmes listened. The city was waking, but carefully, as though aware that something had ended and did not wish to disturb the quiet that followed. Holmes rose and crossed to the window. He drew the curtain back just enough to let the morning in. Pale light spilled across the floor, touching the edges of furniture, softening shadows into gentle shapes. The fog had lifted. Baker Street stretched out before him, clear and ordinary and peaceful. Holmes watched a milk cart pass slowly, the sound of its wheels muted. A shopkeeper lifted a shutter. Somewhere nearby a door opened and closed again. Life resumed, Not dramatically, but naturally. He returned to his chair and sat once more. The case was finished. Not solved in the way newspapers preferred, with excitement and spectacle, but finished in the way stories prefer, by coming to rest. Watson stirred slightly, then opened his eyes. "Morning," he said softly. Holmes smiled faintly. "Yes," he replied, "it is." Watson sat up slowly, adjusting the blanket, his movements unhurried. "I slept," he said, sounding mildly surprised. "As you should," Holmes replied. They sat together in companionable silence, listening to the quiet world outside. After a while, Watson spoke. "It feels," he said, "as though something has finally settled." Holmes nodded. "When weight is released," he said, "the mind recognizes it before the body does." Watson stood and stretched gently, moving to the window beside Holmes. "The river will look the same," Watson said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "but it will feel different." Watson smiled. "I think Miss Morstan will be happy." "I believe so," Holmes said. "Happiness often follows understanding." They shared a moment of quiet warmth. Holmes poured tea, the familiar ritual grounding the morning. Steam rose gently from the cups, curling and fading into the light. "Do you miss it?" Watson asked suddenly. Holmes considered the question. "The pursuit?" he asked. "Yes," Watson said. "The tension, the chase." Holmes shook his head slowly. "No," he replied. "Tension is only interesting when it resists resolution. This story wanted rest." Watson accepted that easily. They drank their tea in silence. The clock chimed softly. Outside, the last lamp was extinguished. Holmes set his cup down and leaned back. "For some," he said, "an ending feels like loss." Watson waited. "But for others," Holmes continued, "it feels like permission." Permission, Watson realized, to move forward, to sleep, to live. The sitting room glowed now with morning light. Dust motes drifted lazily in the air, catching brightness before disappearing again. Holmes closed his eyes, not in sleep, but in contentment. Watson returned to his chair and settled back once more, feeling no urgency to begin the day. Nothing waited for them, nothing called. The city would carry on without them for a while, and that was as it should be. Outside, the day fully arrived. Inside, peace remained. And as Baker Street breathed into the morning, the final echoes of the story faded, not into silence, but into rest. Everything that needed to be known had been known. Everything that needed to be carried had been set down. And with that gentle certainty, the world moved on, quietly, steadily, leaving only calm behind.